that, here's somebody that I think highly of, and that I think that the state thinks highly of, and that everybody would see as an appropriate replacement for somebody as well loved and liked as Barack Obama was. So that was really the intention. I don't know about the regularity of conversations like that. That was just one conversation that I had, and I just think it was important to put forward somebody that was highly respected, because this is, when somebody gets elected president, they're obviously viewed as highly respected, and Senator Obama was, even in the short time that he was in the United States Senate. And so, replacing him with somebody that met the mark, I thought would be very, very important.
Have you been surprised by the response, the intensity of the response from the Black community after hearing?
I think that I'm not surprised. I want to be clear about how I feel about that conversation. Which is that when I listened to it, and I must admit that I didn't remember the conversation. It's almost 10 years ago. Didn't remember the conversation much. When I listened to it, I think, I asked myself, why did I say something, or why didn't I say something? Because I know I'm better than that. I am, and I have been my whole life. And so, I questioned myself about it, and all I can say is that having not done my best, what I want most of all is to make sure that I do better, And I know that in my life I've done a lot better than that, and I know that every day now I do better than that. And one of the reasons that I'm running for governor is because I know that I will deliver on the promise and the opportunity for the African American community. It really is important to me. It's one of the reasons why you were one of the first interviews that I did, here, and we had a very in-depth and long, detailed, I think, interview, and because it's been important to me my whole life that I stand up for the African American community, and it's probably because of how my parents raised me and what I believe about the relationship between the Jewish community and the African American community, what I have believed myself about the oppression and injustice in the African American community, and so that's why I know that I didn't live up to my best values on that day when I was having a conversation. But I also know I've worked hard and so many times in my life and for over so many years to try to do better and do well, and live up to those values.
And I just wanted to add that, I think when we ask the question about typical conversations, that, all of us recognize the need, certainly all of us in the Black community recognize the need to continue to not just, we have this conversation all the time, not just be in a space of voting and helping people get elected, but making sure that there's a seat at the table, a seat to be able to be a decision maker, to have those opportunities, to have those conversations. And I think that's something that JB and we have had a lot of conversations about. I spend a lot of time with him, just about every day. Mm-hmm. And I've been able to observe who he is and the things that are important to him. JB and you talk about typical conversations. It's typical for us to have challenging conversations, to say, well, what do you think about this, and push back. And he views me as a partner, and I appreciate that. Because even joining this ticket, one of the things that we talked about was, I'm not someone that kind of sits on the side. I bring something to the table, and he respects that, he values it, and he sees it as something that's going to contribute to the administration as his partner. So I think none of us would ever say, what, do we need to change the dynamic around making sure that there's more people that look like us and share our values and share our experience at these tables? Absolutely. I think my joining the ticket, the things that we talk about what the administration will look like, the kinds of ideas that JB and I have put forward, it's because of exactly that, of being inclusive and recognizing that we are going to be a better state when you include different perspectives and voices.
What we've typically seen, though, is that in government, usually the lieutenant governor is not as visible, not as accessible in terms of their input. It's almost like a wingman and thankless position.
Yeah. Do you know, Mary, that under the state statute, there's not really a lot of, duties of the lieutenant governor. And so that's why I wanted to say how JB and I have talked about it, where one of the things that we've proposed, and JB really through his leadership, to establish an Office of Criminal Justice Reform and Economic Opportunity, which I've been tasked to lead in the administration. And this is because we know, first of all, that criminal justice reform is not only something that I've been passionate about throughout my career and is important to our community, which is disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system, but we can't talk about criminal justice reform without economic opportunity. Because what happens, if you have economic opportunity, you'll keep people out of the system. And for people who are in the system, when they come back and have an economic opportunity, it keeps them from cycling through the system. So that's one example of the ways that the lieutenant governor will have a more visible role in looking at when we talk about economic opportunity, what needs to happen in our communities to make sure that there's job creation, that when we talk about procurement, when we talk about a strategy for making sure that we are building, all of our communities to be thriving communities, healthy communities. That's the kind of thing that will be addressed. And this is something that JB says he wants to be a top priority. And, I'm grateful that I will have the opportunity to work in that capacity.
So with the commitment, you mentioned that, of course, economic empowerment, making sure that there's resources there for employment and especially small businesses. But then we also look at the quality of education access, healthcare access, and how does that look in terms of major access to financial resources that are limited. We've seen our mayor utilize TIF funds in ways that on the surface appears that there's doing some good, but underneath there's still a lot of decay going on. People are leaving the city. People don't have access to quality food purchases. We still have areas on the south side and a great deal on the west side where you cannot access a full food chain that doesn't have a discount at the end, right? So what are some of the steps that you feel that you are going to make if or when you're elected? Because you're still dealing with a majority Democratic House. And none of these changes have really been made in terms of filtering those funds back to our community, maybe in small doses, but not in a major impact that we've seen.
Well, I don't think anybody has run on those issues before. In other words, one of the reasons that you get things done when you get to Springfield is when you are explicit about what it is that you want and believe and where the resources need to go. I'm not suggesting to you that the people they're necessarily going to change that are in all the offices in Springfield in the legislature, right? That's not always going to change in this election cycle. What is going to change is the leadership and who's providing leadership, what their priorities were when they ran. And so I've been trying to be very explicit about the goal here of lifting up the community. What you just said, and you've encompassed a lot of things because there are a lot of challenges. You talked about healthcare, you talked about education, you talked about the food deserts. These are all real problems. And in my view, got to do two things. One is make sure that the administration has people who come from the communities where these challenges exist, because you cannot get a comprehensive answer if you just put someone who happens to be African American but doesn't come from the community where these challenges are experienced by people. And so because then people can say to me on a daily basis, well, these are the 3, 4, 5 next steps for us to accomplish. So maybe I could break it apart because there's an awful lot packed into your question. But one big important issue is the economic resources that we bring in for business creation and job creation. That's one thing, and it hasn't been done. So I'm going to be clear that we're going to do that. You also have to marry that to increasing the educational resources for people, because it's not sustainable if we don't have good schools. So I've talked a lot about how to improve schools in in Illinois, and particularly in places where they've been left out. We have the challenge, the consistent challenge here of underfunding, and the property tax system being a part of that underfunding. Because what happens is, as you know, in the average state in the United States, half of the money comes from the state for education and half comes from local property taxes. Not in Illinois. Quarter of the money comes from the state and 3/4, or most of 3/4, comes from local property taxes. That's why we have such a regressive local property tax system where, you know, in the poorest communities, you got the highest rates of property taxes, and in the wealthiest communities in Illinois, you got the lowest rates of property taxes, because you're relying upon property taxes to pay for schools. And so people in, you know, lower income neighborhoods have to have higher property tax rates in order to get the money in. That's not right. And that's why we need a progressive income tax that helps us bring money from the state, raise up the 25%, 26% that the state's currently providing to half, or, you know, getting as close as we can, and to evening this out between property taxes and the state funding. That's just one of many issues. You know, if we can lower the property tax burden in lower income neighborhoods and improve the schools at the same time and bring economic resources in for jobs, that has a very, very positive effect, those things. Now, that doesn't even address your other aspects of your question: healthcare, food deserts. We have to address all of these things, and it's not going to be day one. But you start with funding, and you move, you know, and you do it together with this issue of funding education, you know, revenue for education and lowering property taxes. That begins the process.
There has been, I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, in the context of everything that JB just said, we have been